Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to a sound you have never heard before. A heavy, mechanical click echoing simultaneously across the globe. At exactly the same millisecond, every deadbolt retracts, every electronic gate powers down, and every heavy steel door in every prison on Earth swings wide open. More than 11 million incarcerated people are suddenly free to walk out into the sunlight. No alarms, no guards shouting, just an eerie, global silence. Your first instinct is probably pure Hollywood. You picture immediate riots, cities burning, and a chaotic wave of violence sweeping across your neighborhood. But human psychology is far more complicated than a movie script. The reality of what would actually happen in the first 72 hours is much darker, much stranger, and deeply psychological. It does not start with a wave of violence. It starts with a silent, devastating collapse of everything you take for granted. If you enjoy learning how your body, mind, and world really works, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down complex things in simple ways. So, let us look at the clock. The doors just opened. What happens first? To understand the true magnitude of this event, we have to completely erase how movies have taught us to view the justice system. When we hear the word prison, our brains automatically picture the absolute worst of the worst. We imagine millions of dangerous predators pacing in their cells, waiting for a chance to strike. But the global prison population is incredibly fractured and diverse. Out of the roughly 11.5 million people locked up worldwide, a massive percentage have not even been convicted of a crime. They are simply awaiting trial. Millions more are serving time for non-violent offenses, minor drug charges, unpaid debts, political dissent. In many parts of the world, human beings are locked in concrete cells simply because they cannot afford bail. When those heavy doors open, it isn't an instant army of supervillains storming the gates. It is a massive, highly disoriented crowd of human beings. That is a population larger than the entire country of Sweden, suddenly dropped onto the streets with absolutely zero preparation. Releasing 11 million people at once is not a peaceful reset. It is a sudden, catastrophic shock to the very infrastructure of human survival. And the immediate threat to society is not a coordinated crime wave. It is a terrifying logistical nightmare that human civilization is entirely unprepared for. And this is exactly where most people get the threat wrong. The true chaos of the first few hours would not come from calculated malice. It would come from pure, biological desperation. Think about where prisons are actually built. They are intentionally constructed in rural, isolated areas. They are hidden away from polite society, often surrounded by small farming communities or dense forests. The inmates walking out do not have their wallets. They have no identification, no cell phones, and no money. They are released in state-issued clothing, hundreds of miles away from their actual homes. Imagine a quiet town of 2,000 people suddenly flooded by 10,000 released inmates walking slowly down a two-lane highway. Local grocery stores are designed to hold only a few days of inventory for their specific population. Within hours, those shelves would be stripped completely bare. Small-town hospitals would be entirely overrun by people suffering from exposure, dehydration, and untreated medical emergencies. Think about the sheer communication blackout. Most inmates do not have memorized phone numbers for their extended families, nor do they have immediate access to the internet. They would flood local public buildings, gas stations, and libraries, desperately trying to use landlines to contact someone on the outside. With thousands of people trying to do this simultaneously, local networks would jam instantly. People would steal clothes from clotheslines and break into cars just to find a safe place to sleep out of the elements. Supply chains in these bottleneck areas would snap. We actually have a historical precedent for this. In the summer of 1953, following the death of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union enacted a mass amnesty. They opened the gates of the gulags and released over 1 million prisoners almost overnight. The government provided zero infrastructure for their return. What followed was a wave of chaotic survival crime so extreme that entire rural towns were hijacked, and the military had to intervene. Now, multiply that historical nightmare by the entire planet. Yet, there is a second layer to this crisis that almost everyone misses. We naturally assume that the moment the gates open, every single prisoner sprints for the horizon. But the psychological reality of the human brain dictates something entirely different. For a huge percentage of the prison population, sudden, unrestricted freedom would be completely paralyzing. When a human being is placed in a hyper-structured environment where every minute of their day is dictated by an external force, the brain physically and chemically rewires itself to survive. Psychologists call this institutionalization. Inside a prison, you are told exactly when to wake up. You are told when to eat, when to exercise, and when to sleep. The cognitive burden of making daily choices is entirely removed from your life. Over years or decades, the neural pathways responsible for complex decision-making and autonomous planning begin to atrophy. When those massive steel doors finally open, the sudden rush of limitless choices is not liberating, it is psychologically crushing. Many inmates, especially those who have served long sentences, would not run. They would freeze in place. Some would actually refuse to leave the prison grounds. They would simply sit down on their bunks, waiting for orders that are never coming. The outside world is loud, fast, and completely unpredictable. Prison, despite its brutal horrors, is highly predictable. And to the human nervous system, predictability feels exactly like safety. Imagine keeping a deep-sea diver under immense physical pressure for 10 years, and then suddenly shooting them up to the surface in a matter of seconds. The sudden lack of pressure is deeply traumatic. A massive portion of the released population would suffer from acute sensory overload, completely unable to function. We actually saw a microscopic version of this phenomenon in 1980 when Fidel Castro opened the Mariel Harbor. He released thousands of prisoners to flee to the United States. While some integrated smoothly, many were completely overwhelmed by a society they no longer understood, leading to immense psychological distress. Now imagine that psychological shockwave scaled up to 11 million people all over the planet simultaneously. Now, this is where the timeline takes a massive, unexpected turn. While thousands remain paralyzed by choice, and millions more are simply trying to find their way home, a profound psychological shift starts to happen outside the walls. We automatically assume that in this scenario, the prisoners are the only ones whose psychology is being tested. But the biggest, most dangerous mental breakdown actually happens to the rest of us. The true collapse of society would not start with the inmates. It would start with the everyday, law-abiding public. When breaking news alerts flash across phones that every prison on Earth is empty, a massive psychological phenomenon would take over the global population. Fear is a highly contagious pathogen. It moves through human populations much faster than any physical virus. When everyday people believe the system designed to protect them has suddenly failed, they instantly regress to primitive survival instincts. Humans navigate life using something psychologists call the just world fallacy. It is the deep-seated, comforting belief that bad things happen to bad people, and that as long as we follow the rules, a system is in place to keep us safe. Prisons are the physical anchor of that belief. They are the concrete proof that the dangerous elements of society are kept far away from the village. When those walls disappear, the illusion of safety shatters, and when human beings feel that the social contract is broken, they do not wait for the government to fix it. They regress instantly to ancient tribalism. Within hours, normal citizens would begin to barricade their homes, gun sales would skyrocket, ammunition would vanish from store shelves in minutes. Neighborhoods would rapidly form heavily armed, untrained militias. Trust in anyone you do not recognize would drop to absolute zero. To understand why this collision of people is so explosive, we have to look at the deeper science of how the brain reacts to severe stress. When the concept of a prison disappears, your brain experiences something called an amygdala hijack. The amygdala is the primitive fear center of your mind. It acts like an incredibly sensitive smoke detector. When it detects an existential threat, it sounds an alarm that completely shuts down your prefrontal cortex. That is the logical, reasoning part of your brain. You stop thinking about statistics. You forget the fact that most inmates are nonviolent. Your brain shifts entirely into primal survival mode. Now consider the brain of the person who was just released. Long-term imprisonment causes their amygdala to become chronically hyperactive too. They are forced to live in an environment where showing weakness is dangerous, and violence can erupt over a wrong look. At the same time, the hippocampus, the area responsible for emotional regulation, actually shrinks from the unending stress. Imagine a terrified, heavily armed civilian confronting an overwhelmed, hypervigilant former inmate over a stolen loaf of bread or a trespassing dispute. The interaction will almost certainly turn fatal. Not out of pure malice, but out of mutual, uncontrollable panic. It becomes two primitive brains locked in absolute survival mode, incapable of rational thought. By day 3, the physical, mental, and social consequences of this global event would reach an absolute breaking point. Sociologists use a term called anarchy. It translates roughly to a state of normlessness. Anarchy happens when the rules, laws, and moral frameworks that bind a society together suddenly evaporate. If there are no cages to put people in, the perceived cost of committing a crime drops to zero. The sudden realization that actions no longer have legal consequences would tempt everyday people to settle old scores, steal what they want, and act on repressed rage. And while the general public is tearing itself apart, the true apex predators of the prison system would thrive. International crime syndicates, human trafficking rings, and cartel bosses would use the unprecedented societal smokescreen to their ultimate advantage. They would quickly reconnect, eliminate rival gang members out in the open, and seize control of local black markets. Ironically, their very first victims would likely be the thousands of newly freed, vulnerable inmates wandering the streets, instantly recruited or exploited by these organized factions. The medical infrastructure would be the next pillar to shatter. Millions of people were receiving highly regulated daily medical care inside the prison system. We are talking about insulin for severe diabetes, antipsychotics for schizophrenia, critical heart medications. Sudden withdrawal from these treatments would flood local clinics and emergency rooms, which are already overwhelmed by the logistical crisis. The mental health fallout alone would be staggering. Individuals who were stabilized on psychiatric medication inside the prison system would begin experiencing rapid, severe chemical withdrawals out on the streets, completely devoid of any social or medical support. Furthermore, the entire economic engine of the modern world would seize up. The global prison system is a massive, multi-billion-dollar economy. Tens of thousands of guards, administrators, and food suppliers just lost their livelihoods in a single second. Global supply chains would snap as truck drivers refused to transport goods through unpatrolled, lawless roads. Governments would have no choice but to declare global martial law. Militaries would be deployed to the streets. But you cannot arrest your way out of a problem when the very concept of an arrest has been rendered meaningless. Where do you put them? The cure to the chaos would likely look far more tyrannical than the prison system we complain about today. To restore order, temporary detention camps would be built in stadiums and fields. We wouldn't eliminate prisons. We would just change what they look like and who controls them. Which brings us to a profound and deeply unsettling realization. We rarely think about the concrete walls, the heavy steel doors, and the razor wire that sit on the outskirts of our cities. We prefer to keep them out of sight and out of mind. They act as a convenient dumping ground for society's unresolved problems. We use them to hide crushing poverty, untreated mental illness, and severe addiction, rolling them all up with actual violent crime. We use prisons to convince ourselves that evil is something entirely external. We want to believe that badness is a physical object that can be neatly boxed up, shipped away, and ignored. We blindly trust that the system will hold. But if every prison opened at once, we would be forced to face a terrifying truth. If the sudden removal of punishment causes the world to collapse into paranoia, vigilantism, and chaos in a matter of days, then what exactly is holding our civilization together? Are we truly inherently good, moral creatures? Or is the line between a polite, civilized society and absolute primitive chaos maintained solely by the threat of a steel door?